Okay, now I'm going to talk about property. The idea that some object can be the property of some person, or that an area of land can be a property of some person. And also, ideas can be property, ways of doing things can be property. But most fundamentally, I want to talk about how resources can be property. Bits of land, minerals, stuff you pick up, forests, and so on. Now, I was going to post a video because I was sure that someone else had already covered this, but I couldn't find anything. I searched for origin of property, but I couldn't find any videos that actually talked about the origin of property relations. I found videos that purported to justify property relations, to say we should have property because it is this wonderful thing, and this is what you do. And these are, think about this situation where we didn't have property. Oh, it would be terrible. And that's all very well in its way, but it's not about the origin of property. Property is something that human race invented, and the property relations that we have are because of things human beings did in history. And so we would want to think about, and there's two ways to approach this. One is a sort of speculative way to start thinking about anthropology, to how it might have happened that people came together and agreed that to make this institution of property. And the anthropological way of doing it, I think, is you look at pre-industrial tribes and peoples, and think about what happens when a group of people get into an area where there's never been people before. Nothing is owned. Nothing is anybody's property. There's nobody selling anything for them to buy. So if the property, things become property when the human beings in the area say, hey, that's yours, this is mine, that's his, that's hers. Is there a legitimate way to do that? Is there a way to do that that would be morally right? Well, there's two ways of thinking about the morality of property in this situation. One is utility. Utilitarianism might say, divide up the land in a way that works for everybody, that has a result that everybody's better off. Another way is fairness. Look, if someone's put in a lot of work developing a resource and providing things that are a benefit to the rest of the society, that person should have more. And we might say, look, someone's working in this field, producing this crop, we should say that it's their field. Nobody can go in it without their permission. No one can take it away from them without their permission. And we might say that. We can think of an idea of a hypothetical origin of property. And it may very well be that historically, back in the times when we were just becoming human, that they did it that way. That they allocated property purely on the basis of fairness and the welfare of the whole society. But then let's look at the actual property relations that we actually have nowadays, both in the United States, the Americas, and in Europe. And particularly in Europe, any property title you care to investigate, if you go far enough back in history, it exists because of violence. That is, any piece of land that is presently owned in Europe, the title for that land will go back to an invasion, a conquest, or a seizure, where somebody got control of that land by force. Usually it was an invading army. In my country, Great Britain, we had a Saxon king, and then we were invaded by the Normans, William the Conqueror, 1066 and all that. And a lot of land was seized. Most of the land was seized, taken away from the Saxon owners and given to new Norman owners. Is that legitimate? Is that morally correct? And the answer is only if you believe in right of violence, that if someone comes and takes your property by force, it's there. So if someone, makes their living as a mugger by forcing people to give up money and goods, robbery, then that's great, because then they're legitimately entitled to whatever they take from you. But if we don't believe in a right of force, I certainly don't, then the property relations that we have are not legitimate at all. So the question is, what to do? Sometimes people say, well, I bought this in good faith, so therefore it's mine. When they're receiving stolen goods, I don't really think that that's a legitimate moral claim. Imagine somebody steals, say you own a bicycle and someone steals it from you. Say they push you down and ride away with it. Or they say they're going to borrow it, but then they ride away with it. Or they wait till you're not looking and they ride away with it. They force or fraud or some method that we wouldn't consider legitimate. So they take it and they sell it to someone else, and that person gives it to their little brother, and on and on and on. And it eventually ends up in a bike shop. And say 3 months later, you walk into the bike shop thinking of betting on a second-hand bike, and there's your bike. Now, suppose you can prove that you owned that bike and that you didn't sell it. I don't know if the owner is going to give it up. I don't know if the police will help you. I don't know if the courts will help you. I don't know anything about the practical aspect of getting your bike back. But from a moral point of view, has that bike ceased to be your bike? If you had a legitimate property relation with that bike when it was stolen, let's say you made it from scratch, from things nobody had ever known, ever owned. Right? If you had a legitimate property right in that bike when it was stolen, I would tend to think that you still have a legitimate property right in that bike, or that you have some kind of moral claim. So, what does this tell us about property rights and about the idea that property rights is some sort of magical thing, that if you own something, you have an absolute right to do whatever you want with it, and it can't be taken from you. And in fact, nothing that you own can legitimately be taken from you. Because there's this idea that taxation is a form of theft, or a form of slavery, in which if you pay taxes, you're enslaved and you're being forced to labor for the benefit of somebody else. And I don't think that that's reasonable at all. We want to ask, what should we do? Property rights are not legitimate. There's no, they're not justified by the considerations that actually justify natural rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of self-expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of travel. Somebody's property is taken away. They don't lose any of those freedoms. They don't lose their liberty. And if rights are encompassed by liberty, that liberty is not lost when property is seized. So we have to have a basis for saying whether property is legitimate or not. And this will be a social construct, and it will be sort of a kludge, it will be sort of a lash job that we're putting together to be as moral as we can right now. So, since property rights can't be absolute, in my opinion, you definitely don't have to agree with me on this. This is kind of a controversial view, I think. We can take away some property. We can tax people. We can seize property if there's a really good reason to do so. Which brings us back to utility and fairness and so on. So in my view, it's perfectly okay to tax the very, very rich to provide benefits to the very, very poor. That's utilitarianism, and property rights do not override utility here. It's from considerations of fairness, if there's a group of people who are living in poverty or oppression because their land was seized by our ancestors or my ancestors, English, we seize a lot of land. The English are like the worst people in the world. So if there's people who have really gotten it in the neck and are continuing to get into the neck because they've been mistreated by other people whose descendants now own property, it really isn't unfair to tax those descendants to provide benefits to the people who are screwed over. And so the question would be, how much taxation? Would it really impinge on their welfare? It's not a good idea to take a well-off person and a poor person and then make the poor person well-off and the well-off person poor. Utilitarianism doesn't support that. Fairness only supports it where the well-off person is really crooked. But most of the people who own property nowadays didn't steal it. They got it, they inherited it, or they bought it from people who'd inherited it in good faith. And it wasn't, all the seizures took place decades or centuries ago. All right, so that's my pitch on property rights. I don't think that property rights are negative rights. I think they're positive rights, because if you own property and someone walks onto your property and says, this is mine now, you do have a legitimate claim. And your legitimate claim is to whoever is the government, the police, the courts, to come on and say, no, he owns this, she owns this, you can't have this. But in order for that claim to be morally legitimate, it has to fit into, it has to be justified by welfare. I'm not saying that we should not have a property system. I think a property system is a good idea, but it's a social construct that can be modified. The concept of absolute property, where if your ancestor murdered a whole bunch of people and took their land and then passed it down to his son and their son and their son, and then it came down to you, that's not a legitimate property relation. We want to care about your welfare and we don't want to impoverish you. And it's probably okay to let you keep most of that stuff but it's not an absolute right. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention there.